Thank you, Megan Sulak. So maybe a month ago, I was out walking our dog, Phoebe, and instead of enjoying the day and the sunshine and just a little bit of exercise out around our neighborhood, I had a running monologue in my head, wondering how many people were judging me for wearing a coat and a hat when it was 48 degrees, and that's warm in Michigan. I was warm and comfortable and happy, but I couldn't enjoy it. I was second guessing myself and beating myself up and imagining that each car that passed and each person walking was noticing that I was somehow imperfect because I had a hat on. Similarly, when I sit down and play some war games, I'm having a great time. I really am enjoying everything about it. I'm moving pieces around. I like nice steady turns. It's really fun to try and pit different strategies, whatever. But then there's this doubt that creeps into my head. What if I'm not playing it right? If I'm enjoying it, is that not right? But somehow I want to know if I'm doing it the way they want me to do it. The experts, the best, somebody out there. When I was in grade school, my mother worked for a while with a social services organization, and there was a psychologist there, and Mom took me in to speak to the psychologist, and we had a few sessions. We talked about a few books. And at one point she came in and said, so you really are a perfectionist, aren't you? And I took it as a compliment. I was thrilled. Absolutely, I was a perfectionist. I had the ability and was focused very much on making things perfect in my life. And in the several decades since, I have learned that perfectionism can really be problematic in at least three ways. I want to be clear, perfectionism is not just pursuing excellence. Perfectionism is striving for excellence as a starting point and then turns it into this pathological need for absolute perfection. There's always something that can be fixed. We're always shining a light on whatever's worst, as Beyoncé wrote and Deb just sang. And that kind of relentlessness can cause harm in three main ways. It never stops, so it undermines our own sense of self-worth. I'm a bit of a spelling pedant, grammanatrix, as a member has suggested. And so whenever I see the word judgment, I can't help myself. I make sure that there's only one E in it. And if there's that second E, some part of me feels superior to the person that put that word out. And watching cooking shows on TV and someone says, I went to win so badly. And I'm like, yes, you used the adverb. You know, this is a marker of as much as socioeconomic class as it is intelligence. And even if it was intelligence, that does not equate to moral worth. Because I judge others in my head, I assume that they're judging me in their heads. And whether or not they are, my brain does it for them. I judge myself at least as harshly as I judge other. If the standard is perfection, we're going to come up short most of the time and feel worse and worse and worse in the process. And that leads to the second way that perfectionism can be harmful. If I'm always judging and if I believe I am always being judged, then I may begin to hide everything but the most socially approved parts of me. I feel pressure to conform to the dominant culture. I probably don't need to tell a Zoom full of Unitarian Universalists why conformity is problematic. I'll just say that it pushes individuals into closets and other dark corners and robs the society of the strengths that diversity can bring. Perfectionism can be harmful because it teaches us to question the worth of ourselves and others, because it produces and reinforces conformity, and because it prioritizes tasks over relationships. Now, how many of you have ever had a conversation where one person just wanted to listen and share feelings and another wanted to fix things? Guessing many of us. Now, that's kind of a Yang, Yin, Mars, Venus cliche, but it's real, and it's actually more pernicious than just a cliche. Perfectionism gets frustrated by things that it cannot perfect. It celebrates things that can be perfected and devalues those things which cannot be improved or perfected, not improved, perfected. Ideas and objects come to be seen as more important and more inherently valuable than relationships. Relationships can't be fixed. They can't be perfected. They can be made better, yes, but they can't be made perfect. And so perfectionism is frustrated by that. And that resulting devaluing of human relationship weakens us in many ways. It separates us. It gives us fewer ways of finding support, less resilience in our lives, and more lonely, which, as we know, has health consequences. So just the practice of perfectionism minimizes our ability to see worth. It maximizes conformity and devalues human connection. And it gets worse when we look at what gets defined as perfect. Who defines perfection? What is the dominant culture of our UUSA and most of the rest of the world? The racist, capitalist, cisgender, heteropatriarchy. Some people would call that the kyriarchy. An easier way of saying it is white supremacy culture. Notice that's not just racism. The word white is the first word there, so sometimes it gets confused for just racism, but white supremacy culture is a name for all the different interlocking oppressions. The Proud Boys and other so-called alt-right groups often begin recruiting people with an appeal to young men's resentment of women, and they leverage that misogyny into full-blown xenophobia and racism and homophobia. That's how perfectionism is a tool of white supremacy culture. White supremacy culture says everything that is not young, white, male, cisgender, heterosexual, etc. is less than, and perfection is we are imperfect and unworthy. We must conform to find worth. We must not trust the actual source of our strength, which is human relationship, and instead trust only in ideas, especially the ideas of perfection and hierarchy and stoicism. It's like perfectionism and white supremacy culture are two sides of the same coin. Yeah, that's a lot of theory. Let's just talk about some practical examples and then why it's good that I'm telling us these things. So white supremacy culture, perfectionism, teaches us to take any mistake, any flaw, any deviance, and pathologize it into a moral failing. From Clint Smith's poem, we heard, when someone breaks you, they call it your fault. So see if some of these things resonate with you. You see somebody in the store and their child is screaming, or the parent gives the child a swat. That's not a parent having a bad day. That's proof she's a bad mother. You see somebody or see it yourself that I'm overweight. Is that because I have a glandular condition? Am I on metabolism changing medicines? Am I a trauma survivor with limited coping mechanisms? Or am I really just weak and greedy and morally suspect? People who are addicts, we heard Lynn talking about addicts earlier. Alcoholics were treated as immoral and weak and sinners for a very long time, until our Unitarian ancestor, the Reverend Joseph Tuckerman, began treating them as diseased and helping them because they weren't sinners, they were humans with flaws. Took me a very, very long time to learn that people who are often late are not unworthy. People who are not as organized are not unworthy. Look at my office sometime. I am disorganized and I still have inherent worth and dignity. And here's one I think some of us will like. Someone who says something which is not the most recently approved, most progressive, most woke vocabulary, and someone jumps on them and calls them racist swine. Even those of us who are aware and trying to undo white supremacy culture fall victim to its methods sometimes. And the most compelling story I want to share with this is perhaps a decade ago, we're at General Assembly, we're voting on a statement against racism somehow. I forget the exact wording of the thing we were talking about. And of course, people are trying to tinker with the words and the punctuation. And finally, Alandria Williams gets up to the microphone. Now, this is when Alandria was still basically a congregational leader and not yet a leader at the national level, was not yet the moderator of our UUA. Alandria stands at the microphone and she's crying. And when it comes her turn to speak, when E's turn to speak, E says, "My friend just died last weekend. My Black friend died. White supremacy culture made that happen. And I need for you, my religious tradition, my people, the faith into which I was born and have been active. I need you to notice my pain and my hope and stop arguing about commas and just pass this so that I know I am valued in my own religious tradition." And the next person at the microphone began talking about punctuation again. I think that moment was why people rose up and eventually passed that proposal against racism and against white supremacy culture, because grammar isn't more important than a person's life, a person's friendship. And that's why I think it's positive and hopeful to talk about these things. It's not fun to talk about. It's not fun to see the ways that this culture is harmful to us, and how the things that we do and talk about every day can be perceived as difficult and harmful, because we can wake up from this matrix of white supremacy culture and begin to liberate ourselves and others. It's hard work. It's deeply embedded in our culture. It's in everything we were taught. It's in everything, every movie, every song, every advertisement we hear has white supremacy culture built into it and reinforces that. So unlearning that, getting past it, doing the work to see it and change it is very difficult. And one of the cool things about white supremacy culture is it teaches us to think we're not racist. It tells us to deny racism exists. It tells us that speaking about this kind of racism is itself racist. It's very hard to do it, and it's worth it. If we unlearn all of this ourselves, if we cease reinforcing it in our friends and coworkers and neighbors and strangers, if we stop teaching it to our children, if we embrace the multicultural imperfection then someday, maybe, I can walk my dog in peace and play games without questioning myself, and my friends of color won't cry at the microphone and fear for their lives every time they see a police car in their rearview mirror. So may we be.